how does a superpower, a giant that defined half of the 20th century, just vanish? The fall of the Soviet Union is one of the biggest geopolitical puzzles there is. Well, today we're going to look at a really different kind of explanation, a new theory that tries to reframe the whole event. So just take a second to let the speed of this sink in. In 1985, the USSR is one of the two top dogs on the world stage. Then, boom, just 6 years later, it's gone. It didn't lose some massive world war. It just disintegrated. And it's that sheer speed, that velocity, that still has historians scratching their heads. So what really happened? You hear all the usual suspects: bad economics, nationalism, political drama. But the theory we're digging into today points to something completely different, something that isn't rooted in politics at all, but in the very way our minds work. It's a pretty strange lens to look through, so let's just get right into it. Now, to get a handle on this theory, you first have to understand its starting point. And it's a bold one. It basically reframes everything, not just geopolitics, but where we are as a species. Yeah, this is where it all begins, with this really provocative claim. The idea is that as a species, we're still just kids, developmentally speaking. And according to this source, that's what makes our societies so vulnerable, because we're totally clueless about our most powerful and maybe most dangerous tool, our own minds. And that tool has a name in this theory: the human thinking function. Now, don't just think of it as being smart. It's more like the entire operating system for our consciousness. The theory says we're like people using a supercomputer with no idea how the OS works. We don't know how to keep it healthy, what it's for, or even what kind of software it's supposed to run. Okay, so let's break down how this thinking function is supposed to work. The theory lays out a pretty specific process that it says creates the very ideas that our societies are built on. So here's the assembly line, according to the source. You take our core thinking function, you mix it with our ability to believe and to imagine, and what you get is something called fabricated knowledge. Now, that word fabricated is absolutely key here. It means man-made. It's not something we discovered, like a law of physics. It's something we built. And look at what falls under this umbrella. We are talking about the absolute pillars of society: religion, the very idea of a nation, political science, economic systems, all of it. From this point of view, these are all human inventions, products of our childhood stage of thinking. Now, this is where the theory draws a really critical line in the sand. It says that after the Middle Ages, the West's thinking function went into overdrive. It became this hyper-productive engine for creating its own fabricated knowledge. But by contrast, the late-stage Soviet Union's ideological engines started to stall out, and it had to start importing these foreign ideas. Okay, so how in the world does this all lead to the Soviet collapse? Well, this is where we see the theory get applied directly to that moment in history. And there it is. That's the heart of the argument. For the Soviet Union, bringing in Western political science and social theories wasn't some sign of progress. It was a fatal error. You could say it was like trying to run foreign software on totally incompatible hardware. It was just never going to work. The source doesn't mince words at all. It claims this act of borrowing ideas instead of creating its own ripped a hole in their ideology. The whole system's intellectual foundation just crumbled, and since there was nothing original to replace it with, the entire state just fell apart. This naturally brings up the next big question, right? If borrowing Western ideas was so fatal for the USSR, what about China, another major world power? Is it vulnerable to the exact same thing? And the answer, at least according to this source, is a surprisingly firm no. The theory says China is not on the same path at all, and the reason why is really the final piece of this whole puzzle. So, why is China supposedly different? Well, the argument is that it has a kind of immunity, and it all comes back to its relationship with its own human thinking function. This chart gives you a good visual. You've got the West producing tons of its own theories. You have the late USSR running on borrowed ones. But then you see China, which this theory presents as a massive internal producer of its own fabricated knowledge. And remember, the key here is not about quality. It's about sheer volume and being self-sufficient. So here's the bottom line. The source argues that China has been blindly, which, might mean without being fully aware of the process, but very actively using its own thinking function. And the result is this huge, unique ecosystem of self-generated theories. The system is so robust and so self-contained that it doesn't need to depend on foreign ideas, avoiding what the theory calls the USSR's fatal mistake. This all brings us to a really interesting place. The experts behind this are framing it as a kind of new science, one they think can help us understand our own mental operating systems to promote things like harmony and peace. But it leaves us all with a pretty profound question about the world we've actually built. And that's really the thought I want to leave you with today. If all the big ideas that guide us are, in fact, man-made constructs, is being ideologically self-sufficient the only way to stay stable? It's a challenging question, and according to this theory, the fate of entire nations might just hang on the answer. Thanks for joining me on this one.